Coming up tomorrow, State Representative Curtis Trent will join us. We'll talk with him about things in Jefferson City. Certainly Governor Greitens, the status of the House Intel report, what's going to happen there. Things not looking good. We've seen a lot of smoke, and we may be seeing some flames now. So we'll see what happens in that regard. The state budget still has not been resolved. They're in talks about that right now. So much to talk about with Curtis Trent tomorrow. And as always, you can get on the phone and ask questions, make comments while he's here, as you can with my guest right now, Andrew Crocker, political science instructor at Ozarks Technical Community College. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. What is happening in Jeff City?
Chaos.
What is going on?
Chaos.
I think we're up to 3 felony counts on this particular governor. And, this is, especially when he was running for office, and he genuinely did seem like a,
stand-up guy,
model American. Mm-hmm. They're talking about a dude that set up a Veterans Foundation. He is a former Navy SEAL, right. A Rhodes Scholar. Just an absolutely shocking thing to talk about, just being caught completely.
Well, and being a resident of the state of Missouri, it's embarrassing. Whether it's proven to be true or false, it's embarrassing to have to walk through this process.
Does it seem to you, Steve, every time we see a headline on CNN or national news and Missouri's in the headline, you just, before you read the rest of the headline, you start cringing?
You do.
Oh, what happened now?
Oh, man. We're not California. We're not New York. We're not D.C., but here we are right in the middle of all of it.
The second they start talking about Missouri, I know something terrible has happened.
Not good. Not good. How are things at Ozarks Technical Community College?
They're good. Actually, today we have a really interesting event. By the time you and I are done chatting, one of Missouri's 2 senators, Roy Blunt, will be speaking at Missouri.
Nice.
Private event, unfortunately. But it's still kind of cool that we get to host from time to time somebody coming by of that stature. Roy Blunt is not running for re-election. It's a shame I don't get a chance to talk to him, but I can at least spy on him for a little bit.
There you go. We should have brought him with you so he could come along.
No kidding.
We've had him on here a couple times.
No kidding.
He's a gracious man.
Yeah.
We've had Congressman Long on a couple times. And
I know
Senator
that,
Blunt
yeah.
on, so.
I didn't know you brought Senator on, though. That had to be exciting.
Well, it was on the phone. It's not like he walked in the studio.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So
his loss.
Well, you're very kind, very gracious. I want to pick your brain, and I hope that I can frame this accurately. I want to know from the First Amendment perspective.
Yeah.
One of the great things you do for us is break it down from the culture and the historical standpoint of an amendment. And we'll talk about the First Amendment today.
Sure, yeah.
What was their original intent, and where are we today, our interpretation of it today and its usage today? We see so many protests and things going on. The workplace, people are starting to protest in the workplace. Where are they protected? Where are they not? But start with a historical context of the First Amendment.
Well, the First Amendment is one of those areas that is just completely cultural. It evolves radically with every generation because we all speak. It's very, very important that we do so.
Mm-hmm.
And the Constitution itself only provides a fraction of a sentence to even address it. It says Congress cannot abridge free speech. Period. The end. It doesn't define free speech. It doesn't say what free speech is or isn't. Obviously, when the founders were putting the Constitution together, were introducing the Bill of Rights, they weren't thinking of Facebook. They weren't thinking of social media. They weren't thinking of all the ways that the NSA and Amazon and different people can tap into what we have to say and communicate, intercept our communications. So what's free? What's not free? It's just, when we talk about the First Amendment, it's important to remember the first word, Congress. Congress can't abridge. The First Amendment is designed entirely to address potential government repression of speech. It does not apply, by and large, to the private sector or even to government entities like schools. Because, I don't know, Steve, it's been a while since you and I have been to a public school as students. But anytime you walk onto a public school campus, your rights, poof, it's almost like they completely vanish because we can suspend your rights if we have an overriding interest for the better of society. But that's government related. In the private realm, many universities and also at work, your speech is still protected. We can't throw you in jail for saying, Roy Blunt is awful, Claire McCaskill's terrible, blah, blah, blah. but we can't, your employer could have a thing or two to say. And I think that was an actual phrase, is that you can say what you want at work, but your boss has a right to say something in response.
Yeah.
And oftentimes if you go off the deep end, your boss can say, I have the right to say you're fired. And that's, there are certain kinds of speech that are protected at work, but they're all protected around the areas of like labor laws. For instance, you can talk with your coworkers about how much your wages are, because we have an interest in making sure that everybody's paid fairly. You have an interest in, your boss can't tell you no complaining about work. You totally complain about work. That's allowed. And they can't, not only is that allowed, they can't fire you for it. They can't fire you for discussing wages, which, by the way, I learned very recently from some students that not all employers respect that. They will openly tell you, do not talk about wages, which is unconstitutional. That's not allowed, people who's listening. That's not allowed. Your employer can tell you it's unencouraged or discouraged, but they can't tell you that you can't do it. So your speech at work can be sharply limited, just as long as at the end of the day, you're not being like arrested for things you say. You can totally be fired, but you can't be arrested or thrown in jail.
Does the workplace have to declare up front, you are free to discuss this and these parameters, but you cannot go here? Do they have to declare it before they can fire you, or how does that work?
That is labor law type stuff, and I don't think they do. I think in most realms, when it comes to speech, we kind of operate with a common knowledge that your employer can kind of, you want to say and represent your company fairly. I think we all know when we put on our McDonald's shirt or our Subway hat that we need to represent our company fairly, and if we don't, we can face consequences for that. So to that extent, they can rein you in. But again, there are even limitations to that, like you get the ability to discuss your wages and such.
So you brought up Facebook and social media and free speech. If my employer sees something I posted on Facebook and disagrees with either what I'm doing after hours or my lifestyle or my political commentary, can they infringe on that?
To a certain extent.
Are we back into labor law stuff?
We are, but to a certain extent, it does depend on the nature of your job. Like if you are because we've seen this several times. Like my favorite example is Hank Williams, Monday Night Football. Right. He got canned from his job, because he said wildly offensive things on a television interview. If you hold a certain job where you have public presentation and you have a public stature, like Hank Williams did, then to a certain extent, anytime you're speaking publicly, people tend to associate you with the organization that and so under those circumstances, your job can crack down on you. But if you're something like a telecommunications company, like or to a certain extent, even a college employee, you can voice yourself, voice your opinions, and if your employer doesn't like those opinions, so long as those opinions aren't crazily offensive, you should be fine.
Andrew Crocker is our guest, political science instructor at Ozarks Technical Community College. Quick break. We'll come back and talk with him a little bit more. I'm curious if our young people today are correctly applying the First Amendment and all the things they're trying to accomplish these days. So we'll continue our conversation. If you have questions, you're welcome to join the conversation. 417-447-1777.
Hey, this is local sports broadcaster Don West, and you're listening to the KICK Morning Show with Steve Largent on 92.3 KICK.
8:51, the KICK Morning Show, presented by Priority Pest Control, 887-9322. They're online at PriorityPestControl.net. Andrew Crocker, political science instructor from Ozarks Technical Community College, is here. He's here the first Thursday of every month. I can't believe we're already into May, but here we are. Here we go. So we're talking about the First Amendment, and we've had all kinds of protests, school walkouts, things that have gone on, and the young people in our country are trying to find their voice. They're very disappointed in the way older Americans have handled things, the state of our country in certain regards, gun laws, that kind of thing, and they're demanding change. First Amendment. Are they correctly understanding and applying their First Amendment rights from what we see?
This current generation is really interesting because the current generation of college-aged individuals, we're seeing kind of a resistance and a disappointment in the First Amendment from them that we haven't seen in quite some time. The polls suggest that students are less confident the First Amendment is there for them, and they are more comfortable with restricting the First Amendment free speech in a lot of different circumstances. We see this on college campuses all the time when like controversial speakers want to come by and students organize to shut that down.
Right.
So to a certain extent, I can't blame them. They grew up in an era that you and I are completely unfamiliar with. We did not grow up with social media, thank goodness. I don't want all my mistakes. I don't want all my youth splashed on social media. And they have to deal with that. You and I dealt with bullies between the bells, right? They deal with bullies 24/7 because of the internet. And I think their faith in free speech, they understand, they have grown up with an understanding that free speech is a lot more malleable than perhaps you and I grew up believing it was maybe more immutable, that you can't change it, that it can't be altered. Not the case with them, though. They do have the ability to express themselves. They have the ability to speak. They have the ability to protest. It's when it intersects with school that things get really tricky, because your ability to express yourself at school plummets constitutionally the second you step onto a school campus. And that's because we as a society can overrule that freedom. On behalf of society, we want our kids to be safe and protected. We want them to be free of bad influences even. Like you can't wear shirts that advocate for drugs or advocate for gangs or anything like that. You could totally do that out in society though. And the really interesting thing about the walkouts was, you can administer punishment on students for getting up and leaving class. You can. However, as a society, for the most part, we have just decided let these students have their moment. They're growing up in a very difficult time. And so while we can administer punishment, it is up to the administrators, up to the principals, up to the instructors to figure out how they want to address that. Here at OTC, what we did at OTC was we did not endorse or discourage. We just gave a few tacit words towards free speech and every student's right to express itself. But the students, the schools theoretically could find a way to crack down on that if they had it in them. Students are aware of that, and that's just one of the reasons why I think students are just, student and young folks, teenagers and people in their early 20s these days are just a little more sour on the First Amendment comparably to earlier generations.
So administrations, now that we've kind of worked through this initial wave of protests and things, what is their strategy? What does their strategy need to be going forward? Because unfortunately, they're kind of in a reactionary mode now. They've weathered the first storm, but now they need to establish precedent or establish policy going forward.
That's right.
What do you think they'll do?
I think they need to establish policy, like you just said. These students are young, but their voices are just as important as anybody else in society. And they are growing up in an environment in schools that you and I never
Can't
even thought
relate
of. A Columbine happened, I think, when I was a senior. So I just never had to worry about that stuff. And you really do have to address the underlying concerns. I think when you are just trying to treat the symptoms, we need to clamp down on them speaking. We need to clamp down on their expression. We need to make sure that students are expressing themselves appropriately, but not addressing the cause of the expression. You're really it's almost going to be whack-a-mole. For every solution you find, they'll create another way to express themselves.
Well, you can do more harm than good. Yeah. And you've said it a couple of times, and it's very concerning. This generation doesn't feel like the First Amendment is there for them. That's not good. That's
a really interesting way of phrasing it. Yeah. And that's, part of that is because they have grown up in the era of the NSA. Part of it is, I don't know how many times you've done this, Steve. I assume you're on social media. Whenever you just run into somebody and you talk to them for a bit and all of a sudden they show up on your social media. You're like, how did Facebook, how did Twitter, how did these folks know that I was interacting with them? Right. And so like the three big private entities, Facebook, Amazon, and Google, they are tracking your behavior and pitching everything to your behavior. And students are internalizing that as they are coming of age. This is a very influential time in their lives, impressionable time in their lives. And so they're just like, well, if everything I'm saying, even if they agree to it, everything I'm saying, everything I'm interacting with is being recorded and documented and categorized, then what good is the First Amendment really serving me? Now, it is out there. I mean, it's really easy to disregard and take for granted the powers of the First Amendment. Right now we are in negotiations with North Korea, and just looking at North Korea and the complete abolishment of the First Amendment, how quickly things can turn upside down. But again, it's just, there is a difference in distinction. You and I grew up with a more immutable sense of the First Amendment, and then they have to grow up in an era of omnipresent technology that can track their every move.
Great perspective. I hadn't even factored that into looking at young people and the First Amendment today. Andrew, thank you so much. We've got about a minute left here. I'll give you 30 seconds or anything else you want to convey about the First Amendment or the Constitution in general.
Well, one thing that I thought was really fascinating was among the kinds of speech that are protected, hate speech is absolutely constitutionally protected. Matter of fact, the government actually has to make reasonable accommodations for you to say what you need to say. The government can't ban speech. In addition to that, it actually has to make reasonable accommodations for your speech. And as long as we keep that in mind, we will have options to express ourselves, to protest, and to make our intentions heard to the powers that be.
Andrew Crocker, OTC. Folks have questions or want to get a hold of you personally, how do they do that?
Please reach out to me. I love hearing from you guys. Crocker A, that's Crockera, Crocker A, at otc.edu.
8:58, Tech Trends coming up next. ABC News on the other side. Brian Kilmeade's show coming up from 9 to 11. The KICK Morning Show presented by Priority Pest Control, 887-9322.